The observers assignment Zeros sat silently in the control room of the small ship, watching Earth's distant horizon through the viewport. The planet below was full of life, vibrant with activity. It seemed peaceful from a distance, but Zeros knew better. The humans had been at war for years. The battle raged on every corner of their world, and that's why Zeros had been sent. The mission was simple: observe. That was all. No interference, no emotions. Just watch how humans fought, how they strategized, and how they handled conflict. Zeros' species was known for their detached observation, their inability to feel emotions like the humans they were sent to study. Their purpose was to gather data for future analysis. The concept of helping or intervening wasn't in there. Programming from their ship. Zeros had the perfect vantage point high above the battlefield, hidden from human sight, cloaked by technology far beyond what humans could imagine. They had been instructed to focus on the soldiers below, to learn from them without engaging. Zeros had no personal interest in the war. To them, it was just a series of chaotic events, a primitive way for the humans to handle their problems. But the higher-ups had ordered it, so Zeros followed through. They had studied many species before, each with their own quirks and ways. Of life, but none were like the humans. Observing, Zeros murmured to themselves, their voice devoid of emotion. Documenting behavior. The human soldiers below were preparing for another battle, their movements synchronized and precise. Zeros couldn't help but note how different they were from the machines they were used to. The soldiers were covered in dirt and blood, their faces tired but determined. They carried weapons that were nowhere near as advanced as the technology Zeros' species possessed, but there was something about the way they fought, something raw, something human. Zeros watched them closely. They were quick to respond, rushing into position without hesitation. The battle tactics were simple yet effective, using the terrain to their advantage and relying on team coordination. From above, Zeros observed them with the calm distance they had been trained to maintain. But still, something about their behavior felt strange. There was something almost familiar in the way they moved, a connection that Zeros couldn't place. Subject A, soldier, male. Observation, engaging in offensive actions. Loyalty to group observed. Zeros spoke into the recording device, documenting the soldiers' movements. But the longer Zeros watched, the more it became apparent that these humans weren't just soldiers. They were fighting for something. For each other. Zeros hadn't been prepared for that .1 soldier. Lieutenant James stood out among the rest. Zeros focused on him. His movements were calculated, his eyes scanning the battlefield, his mind always 10 steps ahead. He was not just a soldier. He was a leader. The other soldiers followed his every command without question, relying on his instincts. It was clear to Zeros that James wasn't just fighting the enemy. He was fighting for the lives of the men beside him. There was a scene where James pulled one of his soldiers, injured and barely able to move, to safety. James didn't hesitate. He ignored the incoming gunfire, choosing instead to drag his injured comrade to cover. He was putting the lives of others ahead of his own. Zeros had read about such behavior in their studies of human history, but to see it firsthand was different. The human's capacity for loyalty, for sacrifice, was something Zeros couldn't understand. It wasn't a part of their species' nature. It was something beyond reason. Something human. Subject B, soldier, male. Observation. Loyalty to comrade observed. Willingness to risk self for others noted. As Zeros continued to observe, they couldn't deny the strange stirrings inside them. The emotions they had been trained to avoid seemed to bubble up unexpected and confusing. The humans below, their lives constantly at risk, didn't seem to be fighting for power or fame. They fought for each other, for their families, for a future. Zeros' ship hovered in the shadows, invisible to the human eyes below. Yet for the first time, Zeros felt more than just the cold duty of observation. They felt something deeper, something that they didn't understand. It wasn't just data they were collecting anymore. It was something human, something real. Humanity. Zeros muttered to themselves. Not just fighting to survive. They fight for more. Their heart, or what passed for it, seemed to beat faster. They felt a pull they hadn't expected. Was it admiration? Respect? Could an alien being even feel such things? These humans, these warriors, were fighting against everything in the world, but they didn't seem to care about the odds. They kept pushing forward. Together, Zeros knew it wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to observe, to stay detached. But the more they saw, the harder it became to ignore what was unfolding beneath them. Was this the true nature of humanity? To fight for something more than survival? To fight for one another against all odds? The battle below intensified, but Zeros couldn't pull their eyes away from the humans they had been sent to observe. Each movement, each sacrifice, felt more significant than anything they had ever recorded. And for the first time, Zeros questioned the very reason for their mission. Were they just here to watch? Or had something inside them begun to shift? Something that made them feel a connection to the very beings they were sent to study? For the first time, Zeros wasn't just watching humanity, they were feeling it. And that feeling couldn't be erased. The human connection. The days passed, and Zeros found themselves drawn back to the same battlefield, observing the humans as they fought not for land, not for power, but for something that Zeros couldn't quite understand. The deeper they watched, the more their purpose as a detached observer began to blur. They had been sent to document the way humans fought, but it was no longer just about tactics and strategy. It was about the people behind the fight, the bonds they shared, the sacrifices they made. Lieutenant James, whom Zeros had begun to focus on, remained at the center of their attention. Zeros had observed soldiers before, but never one like James. There was something in the way he moved, in the way he spoke to his men. It wasn't just authority. It was care. James wasn't just leading his squad through the war zone. He was guiding them through the very core of their fears. Each day, James and his unit faced more and more danger. And each day, Zeros watched as James's leadership kept them together. But it wasn't just orders. It was the way James's soldiers trusted him without question, how they looked to him for comfort in the chaos. It was in the way they fought, side by side, even when the odds seemed impossible. One evening, after a particularly brutal attack, Zeros watched as James sat alone by a dim fire, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes alert, scanning the surrounding area. The war had drained him, but there was something about his expression that caught Zeros' attention. It was the first time Zeros had seen vulnerability in James, something raw, human. Despite his position as a leader, despite his strength, James carried the weight of his men's survival on his shoulders. Zeros moved closer, still hidden, their ship hovering just above the camp. They watched as James spoke to himself quietly, his words barely audible, but filled with a weight Zeros hadn't expected. Are they going to make it out of this? James muttered, staring at the fire. What if we don't? What if we fail? Them? Zeros had never heard an alien, especially one like James, express such doubt. It was a human vulnerability, one that they could feel but not fully comprehend. This doubt, this fear, was a part of humanity's reality. Yet James didn't give in to it. He wasn't wallowing in his fears. He was confronting them, not with detachment, but with the kind of care and responsibility only a leader could understand. Zeros realized, with a jolt, that James wasn't just a soldier. He was a protector. His entire being was shaped by the desire to ensure that his men survived. But the price he paid was immense. It wasn't just the physical toll of the war. It was the emotional cost of carrying the lives of others in his hands. Every soldier's life was his responsibility, and in the dead of night, when the world was quiet and the fight was over, James was alone with the weight of it all. Zeros had never considered these things before. They had never thought that the purpose of war could be anything other than survival. They were used to the clean, emotionless efficiency of their own species, where survival was an automatic response, a logical outcome. But humanity's survival was different. It was more complicated. It was interwoven with love, loss, sacrifice, and compassion. And Zeros felt something they hadn't expected: admiration. It wasn't just for James. It was for humanity itself. The next day, Zeros continued their surveillance. But now they couldn't help but notice the small, quiet acts of humanity that went unnoticed by most. In the midst of the chaos, in the shadows of war, soldiers would stop to help an injured comrade, share what little food they had, or comfort one another. The bond between them was strong, not just out of necessity, but because they genuinely cared. Zeros watched as James continued to lead, keeping his men together, helping them survive. Yet, in every moment, he was carrying the invisible burden of each soldier's life. But it wasn't just James who caught Zeros' attention. The other soldiers, the ones who followed him, were just as remarkable. Zeros observed a quiet moment between two soldiers, Mia and Connor, where Mia, injured and covered in dirt, smiled weakly as Connor wrapped her wound. "We'll get through this," Connor said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We always do." Mia laughed softly, though it was more of a cough than a laugh. "I don't know how you do it, Connor. You're always so calm. You should be the one leading the squad." Connor shook his head, his expression softening. "No, Mia. James leads because he cares. That's what makes him a great leader." Zeros couldn't pull away. The bond between the soldiers was undeniable, and it was clear to Zeros that it wasn't just the battle that kept them going. It was the trust they had in each other, the way they supported one another through the hardest moments of their lives, risking everything not just for themselves, but for the others beside them. James's leadership wasn't defined by military tactics or knowledge of war. It was defined by his ability to connect, to make his men believe they could make it through, no matter what. Zeros' observation had begun to shift. They had thought humanity's greatest strength was their survival instincts. But now, Zeros realized it was more than that. It was their ability to care for each other, to fight for each other, that gave them their strength. Zeros had not expected to feel anything during this mission. But now, they couldn't help but wonder, could they truly remain detached from these humans? Could they watch as they fought, as they sacrificed, knowing that these humans were something more than just data, points in a study? As Zeros hovered in the shadows, their thoughts churned. The mission had been clear: observe, report, and leave. But Zeros had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer just watching. They were beginning to feel a connection to these soldiers, especially to James and his unit. And it left them with a question they never expected to ask. Could they really just observe? Or was it time to act? The true cost of Warxeros had watched countless battles before. The roar of weapons, the clash of armies, the victory cries and death screams that marked the end of wars. They were nothing new. But nothing had prepared them for the humanity they were now seeing firsthand. Every day, as they watched James and his men fight, they saw more than just soldiers in combat. They saw people, humans with hearts, souls, and stories far deeper than the number Zeros had recorded in their mission logs. The battles continued to rage, each one more brutal than the last, each one leaving more soldiers dead or injured. Yet the human spirit refused to yield. It was in every soldier's step, in every glance exchanged between comrades. Despite the violence, the suffering, and the hopelessness, humanity fought not for glory or victory, but for the ones they loved and the ones they had lost. Zero's thoughts were consumed by this truth. As the days blurred into nights, they continued to follow James's unit, observing every step they took. The soldiers were tired physically and mentally exhausted, but in their weariness, there was still a fierce determination. It wasn't just about the war anymore. It was about survival. It was about the people they fought for, the future they dreamed of. One evening, after a particularly savage encounter with the enemy, Zeros watched as James and his men huddled together, trying to find comfort amidst the chaos. The night air was thick with smoke, and the distant sounds of explosions and gunfire seemed to echo forever in the cold silence. James sat apart from the others, his back to the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. His uniform was torn, blood smeared across his arms and chest, but he didn't seem to notice. He was lost in thought, his eyes distant, staring into the fire. The other soldiers spoke in hushed tones, but James remained quiet, lost in the weight. Of everything he had seen, Zeros focused on James, observing his every movement. They had been monitoring him for days, and the more they saw, the more they realized something profound. James wasn't just a leader. He was carrying the burden of every life under his command, every soldier, every fallen comrade. Zeros had seen this burden before, but never so clearly. The way James shouldered the weight of the war, the responsibility of each man's survival, was beyond anything Zeros had understood before. Zeros could no longer remain completely detached. Their mission had always been about recording facts, analyzing behavior, and observing the strategic decisions of humanity. But now, the data seemed irrelevant. Zeros had seen what war truly cost, not just in terms of lives, but in terms of the human spirit. Every soldier they watched was paying a price, each of them slowly unraveling, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person they once were. But it wasn't just James who had begun to change. Zeros watched as the soldiers around him struggled with their own demons. There was Mia, a young soldier who had lost her brother in the early stages of the war. Every day she fought with everything she had, but Zeros could see the sorrow in her eyes. She fought not for victory, but to honor the memory of someone she loved. Connor, another soldier, had been wounded in battle. His body had healed, but his mind was fractured. The constant bombardment, the deaths of friends, the bloodshed, it had taken a toll on him. But he kept fighting, not because he believed in the war, but because he couldn't let his comrades face the horror alone. And then there was Tom, the newest member of James's unit. Tom had joined the army with dreams of making a difference, of fighting for something greater. But Zeros could see that the reality of war had already begun to wear him down. His youthful optimism had begun to crack. He had lost too much, seen too many things that no one should ever have to see. Zeros watched him as he tried to comfort an injured comrade, his hands shaking as he bandaged the wound. The cost of war wasn't just in lives lost. It was in the loss of humanity itself, the slow erosion of the spirit, the breaking of the soul. Zeros had expected to witness the mechanics of war, the strategies, the tactics, the fights. But what they had found instead was something far more complex. The real cost of war was the damage it did to the people who fought in it. Zeros had never felt anything like this before. Their species had no concept of the emotions humans carried with them into battle. For Zeros, everything was logical, calculated, and precise. Emotions had no place in their world. Yet, here they were, seeing soldiers fight, not because they had TL, but because they chose to. They fought for each other, for the people they loved, for the idea that they could make the world better by fighting together. And then the inevitable moment came, the one Zeros had been dreading. A call came through the communication system. There was a new battle, and James's unit was to lead the charge. The enemy forces were strong, and the casualties were expected to be high. But James's orders were clear: hold the line, protect the civilians, and ensure that their mission succeeded. As James rallied his men, Zeros could see the weight of the decision in his eyes. He knew what would happen. They all did. There would be deaths. There would be sacrifices. And yet, James led his men forward, without hesitation, without doubt. It was the only thing they could do. Xeros watched as the soldiers prepared for their final stand. They were no longer just soldiers. They were people filled with fear and hope, with love and loss, carrying the weight of their choices. Zeros had seen countless armies before, but none like this. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the things that made life worth living: love, loyalty, sacrifice. Zeros couldn't look away. What was happening in front of them was more than just a battle. It was the human soul laid bare, exposed in all its strength and vulnerability. And for the first time, Zeros wondered if their mission, just observing, just recording, was enough. Could they stand by and watch these humans fight, knowing the cost? Or would they be compelled to act, to intervene? As the battle began, Zeros's thoughts remained focused on James and his men. They were ready, but Zeros wasn't sure if they were. Would they be able to survive? Would humanity survive? In that moment, Zeros knew something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer just observers. They were feeling. And in that feeling, they had already become part of the story. The growing conflict Zeros couldn't escape the truth that had become impossible to ignore. The humans they had been sent to observe were more than just fighters. They were people flawed, emotional, and deeply connected to one another in ways that Zeros couldn't begin to comprehend. Every day, the weight of what they witnessed sank deeper into Zeros's mind. It was no longer just about war. It was about everything that war cost, and it was a truth that Zeros couldn't deny any longer. The battle raged on, relentless and unforgiving. James's unit, though weary and battered, continued to fight. Each day, the soldiers looked more broken, their faces haunted by the things they had seen. But still, they fought for each other, for the ones they had lost, and for a hope they couldn't quite explain. Zeros had observed many species before, but nothing like this. The human spirit was both fragile and indestructible, driven by love, fear, and the unyielding desire to protect. One day, during a brief lull between engagements, Zeros watched James. He stood apart from his men, his back to the war, his gaze lost in thought. His eyes, once filled with the sharp clarity of a leader, now seemed distant, clouded with an overwhelming weight. The war was taking its toll on him, just as it had on all of them. But for James, it was different. He was the one who held the pieces together. He was the one who couldn't afford to break. Zeros had been observing James for weeks now. The longer they watched, the more they realized how much James had come to rely on his soldiers, not just as a commander, but as a human being. He wasn't just leading them through battles. He was guiding them through their darkest moments, helping them find purpose in a world that seemed bent on destruction. The bond between James and his unit was something that Zeros had never seen before. It wasn't a bond formed through necessity, alone. It was a bond built on trust, sacrifice, and the need to ensure that no one was left behind. As Zeros watched James from above, they couldn't help but wonder, what drove him? What kept him going, even when the odds were so overwhelmingly stacked against him? There was no reason, no logical explanation, that humans should continue fighting with such intensity. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of losing everything. Yet they fought on, with nothing but their bonds to one another, to keep them moving forward. Zero's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant explosions. The war had found its way back to James's unit. The tranquility of the moment was shattered, and the soldiers immediately went into action. Zero's watched as James swiftly gave orders, his voice calm but full of authority. He was no longer just a leader of soldiers. He was the embodiment of every soldier's hope, every soldier's will to survive. Zero's observed how James's men responded to him, how they moved in synchrony, anticipating his commands without needing to ask. They followed him because they trusted him, because they knew that he would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. And it wasn't just the soldiers under his command. Even the ones who didn't know James personally could sense it. Their desire to fight, their desire to protect, came from the example he set. As the battle intensified, Zero saw something they hadn't expected. A young soldier, Tom, had been separated from the main group, caught in the open with enemy fire closing in on him. Zero's heart skipped a beat as they watched Tom struggle to reach cover. But before they could process what was happening, James appeared swift, decisive, and without hesitation. "Tom!" James shouted through the static of his comm. "Move now!" But Tom couldn't move. He was pinned down, his leg injured from the explosion that had thrown him to the ground. And as the gunfire grew louder, Tom's face twisted in pain and fear. Without thinking, James dashed forward, charging straight into the open. His soldiers shouted for him to stop, to take cover, but James ignored them. He moved like a force of nature, guided by a sense of duty that was beyond reason. Zero's watched, shocked, as James reached Tom's position, dragged him to safety, and shielded him from the gunfire with his own body. In that moment, Zero's understood. This wasn't just a war. It wasn't just about tactics, weapons, or victory. It was about human connection, the fierce loyalty that bound these soldiers together. James's act wasn't just bravery. It was love. The love of a leader for his men, and the love of humanity for one another. Zero's had been an observer all their life. They had seen countless battles, countless moments of survival and destruction. But never before had they seen anything like this. This act of selflessness, this deep bond between people, they couldn't look away. They were no longer just watching history unfold. They were feeling it. As James's soldiers regrouped, Zero's watched James, his face grim, but filled with purpose. He was covered in dirt, blood, and exhaustion, but there was no sign of fear. There was only resolve. He had saved Tom, but at what cost? Zero's knew that the more James and his men fought, the more of their humanity they would lose. The price of war wasn't just in lives lost. It was in the toll it took on their spirits, their minds, their very souls. But still, James stood tall. He hadn't broken. Not yet. Zero's thoughts were clouded with doubt. How could they continue to just watch? How could they remain impartial when they had seen the human soul so clearly laid bare? Was it really possible to stay detached, to remain unaffected by what was happening below? And then, as Zero's watched James lead his men through the wreckage of the battlefield, they knew one thing for sure. They could never go back to being just an observer. They had already seen too much, and the time for action was coming. The Trialxeros had never been prepared for this moment. The feeling of betrayal was foreign to them, something they had only read about in human history. To feel it deep in their core was a shock. They had come to Earth to watch, to record the behaviors of humans during wartime. But now they found themselves trapped in a web of lies and deceit, spun by someone they had come to trust. The mission that once felt so clear and detached had turned into something far more complicated. It all began when Zero's had noticed something strange. Lieutenant James's unit had been performing well, but there was an underlying tension. It wasn't in their movements or in their voices, but In the way, some of the soldiers looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. It was subtle, like a shadow, a quiet undercurrent of doubt. Zeros knew that something was off, and when they began to focus on the source of this tension, it didn't take long for them to uncover the truth. Samuels, one of James's most trusted soldiers, had been acting strangely. At first, Zeros dismissed it. Soldiers were under stress. It wasn't uncommon for them to show signs of exhaustion or anxiety. But Samuels's behavior was different. He had been seen meeting with enemy agents in secret, passing information, and always sneaking off to the outskirts of camp when others weren't looking. The pattern was clear. Samuels was working with the enemy, betraying James and his men. Zeros couldn't believe it. How could someone so deeply embedded in this unit, someone who had fought beside James, do something so treacherous? The more Zeros observed, the more the truth became undeniable. Samuels was not just a traitor. He was actively sabotaging the very people who had trusted him. The most damning evidence came one evening, when Zeros overheard a conversation between Samuels and an unfamiliar figure on the outskirts of camp. The conversation was quiet, but clear. Enough for Zeros to understand the gravity of the situation. "I've delivered everything you asked for," Samuel said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "The information I've sent will lead to their downfall. James's unit will be destroyed, and the humans won't stand a chance once the real attack begins." The figure replied in a language Zeros couldn't understand, but it was clear that the deal was sealed. Samuels had been betraying James for weeks, feeding false intelligence to the enemy, guiding them to the weak points in the human defenses. Zeros's heart pounded in their chest as they processed what they had just heard. The soldiers they had come to admire, the ones they had followed into battle, were being set up to fail. Samuels's voice cut through Zeros's thoughts. "The sooner I get them all killed, the sooner I can move on to the next phase of the plan. Earth will fall, and I will have a place among the victors. You don't need to worry about me. I'll make sure James and his men are wiped out, and the humans will never know what hit them." Zeros couldn't stay hidden any longer. They had seen enough. The betrayal had gone too far. They had watched these soldiers fight, live, and die for each other, and now Samuels's treachery threatened everything. Zeros knew what they had to do, but the decision was not easy. For so long, Zeros had maintained their role as an observer. They had followed their mission without question. But now, their understanding of humanity had changed. They weren't just observing anymore. They were feeling, and that feeling made it impossible to stand idly by. Zeros knew that they couldn't confront Samuels directly, at least not yet. The soldiers, including James, were already vulnerable. If Zeros made their presence known, it could jeopardize everything. But they had to warn James. They had to stop the betrayal before it was too late. Zeros activated the ship's communication systems, sending a message directly to James's secure channel. It was a short, cryptic message, one that Zeros hoped would get through to the lieutenant without alerting anyone else. "Lieutenant James," the message began, "trust no one. There is a traitor in your midst. Samuels is working with the enemy. He's been feeding them your positions. Act quickly before it's too late." Zeros didn't expect a response. They didn't need one. The message had been sent, and now James had a chance. A chance to fight back, to protect his men, and to stop the destruction Samuels had been orchestrating. Zeros wasn't sure if they had done the right thing. For the first time, they questioned their own motives. Was it their place to intervene? Had they already crossed the line between observer and participant? As the message sent, Zeros watched from the shadows. The quiet war within them, the battle between duty and emotion raged on. They couldn't ignore the pull they felt to protect these humans. But that meant they had already chosen a side. They were no longer just watching. They were part of the fight. The escape Planxeros sat in the shadows of their ship, hidden from view by the cloaking technology that had been keeping them safe for so long. The vastness of space was silent, cold, and yet Zeros' mind was far from peaceful. The decision to intervene had already been made. The war had become more than just a series of observations, more than just watching humans fight in battle. It had become personal. Samuels's betrayal weighed heavily on Zeros. The soldiers they had been watching, Lieutenant James, Mia, Tom, Connor, and the rest were in danger. They were walking into a trap, and unless Zeros acted, it would be the end of James's unit. Zeros had watched enough. Now they had to warn James, but it wasn't going to be easy. The alien forces were closing in, and Samuels had already set everything in motion. The alien fleet was just a few days out, and Zeros knew time was running out. They had already disabled the enemy's communications once, but it wouldn't be long before they regrouped and launched a full assault. Zeros had to act fast. The plan was simple, but it was risky. Disable the alien fleet's approach long enough to give James and his men a fighting chance to escape and prepare for the inevitable. Battle.xer OS quickly accessed the control systems of their ship, preparing the final sequence of actions. They needed to send a warning to James, something that would get through without alerting Samuels or the enemy forces. But it wasn't enough to just send a message. Zeros had to give James a way to protect his unit, a way to fight back. Zeros's fingers moved rapidly over the control panel, their mind focused. They had always been taught to stay out of the fray, to observe from a distance. But this was different. The more they observed humanity, the more they understood the power of unity, the way humans cared for one another, how they would lay down their lives for the people they loved. That wasn't just a weakness. It was their greatest strength. After a few tense moments, Zeros activated the emergency communication system, sending a direct and encrypted message to James's secure channel. It was brief and to the point. Zeros couldn't risk giving too much away. Samuels would know something was wrong if the message seemed too urgent. Lieutenant James. The message began, "The alien fleet is coming. Samuels has betrayed you. He's been feeding the enemy. Your plans. You must evacuate immediately. I will help you. Do not trust anyone." Zeros hesitated before sending the message. It was risky, sending it with so little context, but it was their only chance. The aliens had set up a coordinated attack, and unless James acted fast, he and his men would be caught in the crossfire. But Zeros didn't just want James to escape. They wanted him to win, to survive. The human spirit was something they had come to understand, and it was something worth fighting for. As the message went through, Zeros turned their attention to the alien fleet, which was rapidly advancing toward Earth. The fleet was massive, far beyond anything humanity could face without help. Zeros quickly reconfigured the ship's weapon systems to create a diversion, a pulse of energy that would temporarily disable the alien fleet's communication and targeting systems. It wouldn't destroy them, but it would slow them down long. Enough to give James a chance. The hum of the ship's systems grew louder as the power surged through the ship's core. Zeros activated the cloaking system once more, making sure they remained undetected by the alien fleet. The final pulse was set, deploying energy pulse in 3, 2, 1. A sudden flash of light filled the viewport, and Zeros felt the ship shudder as the pulse of energy was sent out, reaching the alien fleet. The light was brief, but it had the intended effect. The alien ships staggered as their communication systems were temporarily knocked offline. It was only a momentary setback, but it would be enough. The fleet slowed, confused by the disruption, giving James's unit the time they needed. Zeros took a deep breath, knowing that the risk was far from over. The alien fleet would soon recover, and the battle for Earth would begin in earnest. But At least now, James and his men had a chance to survive. Zeros knew they had to be ready for what was to come. If humanity stood any chance of winning, it would require not just their courage, but their unity. As the power settled back into a steady hum, Zeros turned to the comm systems once again, this time contacting James directly. "James, it's Zeros," came the calm voice through the comms. "I've disabled their communications. You have a window to escape, but you must move now. Prepare for battle." The transmission ended quickly, and Zeros took a moment to process everything. They had crossed the line. They were no longer a detached observer. Zeros had made a choice. They had decided to fight for humanity's future. But even with the pulse of energy sent out, and the alien fleet temporarily disabled, Zeros knew the fight wasn't over. The true test was still ahead. The alien forces would soon regroup, and their full-scale invasion would begin. But there was hope now. Humanity had one last chance, and Zeros would stand with them as the ship silently drifted through space. Zeros prepared for what was to come. The future was uncertain, but Zeros knew one thing for sure. This war was no longer just about survival. It was about something far more powerful. It was about standing together, united against a common enemy, and fighting for a future that could never be taken. * The end?